In 2018, archaeologists working in the Black Desert of Jordan found something that rewrote the history of food: charred crumbs of a flatbread, baked by hunter-gatherers roughly 14,000 years ago. That is thousands of years before humans even started farming. The leading theory now is that we didn't invent bread because we had grain. We started growing grain because we wanted more bread. And in the thousands of years since that first loaf, bread has been currency, sacred offering, survival ration, and even the subject of actual government legislation. These are 8 of the most iconic breads in the world, and the stories behind them are stranger than you'd expect. Sourdough, the oldest form of leavened bread, with roots going back to ancient Egypt around 1500 BC. The discovery of sourdough was almost certainly a happy accident. Someone left a batch of dough sitting out long enough for wild yeast and bacteria floating in the air to colonize it, causing the dough to bubble and rise on its own. The Egyptians were already brewing beer at the time, so wild yeast was practically everywhere. What makes sourdough different from regular bread is that it uses no commercial yeast at all. A sourdough starter is a living colony of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria, and it does all the work. It leavens the bread and gives it that signature tangy flavor. For the vast majority of human history, this was actually how all bread was made. Commercial baker's yeast has only been widely available for about 150 years. French bakers carried sourdough starters with them to Northern California during the 1849 gold rush, and the bread became so closely associated with the city of San Francisco that scientists named the dominant bacterium after it. It is called Fructolactobacillus sanfrancisensis. Even the miners got in on the tradition. During the 1898 Klondike gold rush up in Alaska, prospectors loved their sourdough starters so much that they slept with the pouches tucked inside their clothing to keep the cultures from freezing overnight. The miners themselves eventually earned the nickname sourdoughs because of it. San Francisco's Boudin Bakery, which opened in 1849, claims its mother dough traces all the way back to a gold rush miner's original starter, and legend says the founder's wife rescued a bucket of that starter from the rubble during the 1906 earthquake before saving anything else. Sourdough had a massive revival during the 2020 COVID lockdowns, when commercial yeast sold out in grocery stores everywhere and home bakers around the world rediscovered wild fermentation from scratch. Baguette. Despite feeling ancient and deeply French, the modern baguette is surprisingly young. It only emerged in Paris, somewhere between 1900 and 1920. Long, thin loaves existed in France before that, but the baguette as we know it came together with the arrival of steam ovens, introduced by an Austrian baker named August Zang around 1839, and the development of more refined white flour. There are several colorful origin stories, and none of them hold up to serious scrutiny. One claims Napoleon ordered thin loaves that could fit in his soldiers' trouser legs during marches. Another says Paris metro construction workers in the early 1900s kept getting into knife fights over bread, so bakers designed a loaf you could tear by hand instead of slicing. A third credits a 1920 law banning bakers from working before 4 in the morning, which supposedly forced them to switch to quicker baking thin loaves. All entertaining, all probably fiction. What is confirmed, though, is that France literally passed a law to protect the baguette. In 1993, a decree was issued stating that a traditional French baguette can only contain wheat flour, water, salt, and yeast or sourdough leaven. No freezing, no additives, and no shortcuts of any kind. A genuine baguette goes stale within 24 hours, and that is not a defect. That is proof it is real. The law was a direct response to the decline of traditional baking across France, where bread consumption had collapsed from 600 grams per person per day in 1900 to just 170 grams by 1986. Industrial bread was killing the craft, and the government stepped in. Every year since 1994, Paris has held the Grand Prix de la Baguette, where 14 judges taste entries from nearly 200 bakers across the city. The winner receives €4,000 and earns the right to supply the French president's Élysée Palace with fresh bread every single day for a year. In 2022, UNESCO officially added the artisanal craft of baguette making to its intangible cultural heritage list, ciabatta. If the baguette feels ancient but is not, ciabatta does not even pretend. It was invented in July 1982, and the person behind it was not a baker by trade. Arnaldo Cavallari was a four-time Italian rally car racing champion who had become a flour miller in the Veneto region of northern Italy. Cavallari watched French baguettes steadily take over Italy's sandwich market, and he decided to do something about it. After weeks of experimentation with baker Francesco Favarone, Cavallari found his breakthrough in a very high hydration dough, roughly 75% water, combined with olive oil to keep it elastic. The result was a flat, airy loaf with big, irregular holes inside and a crackly, flour-dusted crust on the outside. He named it ciabatta, Italian for slipper, because the slouchy, lopsided shape reminded him of a well-worn house shoe. The bread took off remarkably fast. Cavallari's company licensed the recipe to bakers across 11 countries within 17 years, and ciabatta was already sitting on shelves at Marks & Spencer in the United Kingdom by 1985. When critics later claimed he had simply repackaged an older Italian recipe, Cavallari challenged them to produce any evidence that ciabatta existed before 1982. Nobody could. Today, it is a global sandwich and panini standard, and the whole thing started because one Italian miller refused to let the French win. Pumpernickel. This dark, dense rye bread comes from the Westphalia region of Western Germany, and it has one of the best backstories in all of food. The name Pumpernickel roughly translates to devil's fart. It combines the old German word pumpern, meaning to break wind, with nickel, a name associated with goblins and the devil, similar to Old Nick in English. It was a blunt reference to the bread's reputation for being difficult to digest, and the flatulence that all that heavy rye tended to cause. There is a more dignified alternative story claiming Napoleon tried the bread, found it revolting, and declared it only bon pour Nicole, meaning good enough for his horse Nicole. A better tale, but the word pumpernickel appears in German texts well over 100 years before Napoleon was born. What makes traditional Westphalian pumpernickel truly unusual is the bake. The loaves go into covered pans at a low temperature, around 120 degrees Celsius, and stay there for 16 to 24 hours. During that marathon bake, the Maillard reaction slowly transforms the entire loaf. It is the same chemical process that browns a steak on a hot grill or turns white bread golden in a toaster. In pumpernickel, it produces a deep chocolate brown color and a sweet, almost coffee-like flavor with absolutely no artificial coloring added at all. If you have only had American deli pumpernickel, which is usually just wheat rye bread tinted with molasses or cocoa powder, the real Westphalian version is an entirely different experience. Naan. The word comes straight from Persian and simply means bread. Naan has Persian roots and traveled to the Indian subcontinent during the Delhi Sultanate. The earliest known written mention appears in the work of Indo-Persian poet Amir Khusrau around 1300 AD, who described two varieties served at the imperial court in Delhi. One was thin and light. The other was baked inside a clay tandoor oven. For centuries, naan was considered a luxury reserved for Mughal royalty and the upper classes, because the tandoor ovens needed to make it were expensive and highly specialized. It was not until around the 1700s that naan became more widely available to the general population across the subcontinent. The baking process itself is what makes naan so distinctive. The dough, which is leavened with yeast and often enriched with yogurt, gets slapped directly onto the inside wall of a blazing hot clay tandoor oven. These ovens reach temperatures of around 480 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The bread bakes in just minutes, developing charred, blistered spots across the surface while staying soft and pillowy inside. That classic teardrop shape is not something bakers create on purpose. It happens naturally as the dough stretches and droops under its own weight while cooking on the vertical wall. And one detail that catches people off guard: cheese naan, which feels like it should trace back centuries to some ancient Mughal court kitchen, was reportedly created in Paris during the 1970s by South Asian restaurateurs adapting the bread for French diners. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. I cover food history and explainers like this every week. Now let's head across the Atlantic. Tortilla. The corn tortilla is one of the oldest prepared foods in the Western Hemisphere. Corn was first domesticated in what is now central Mexico around 9,000 years ago, and tortillas became a widespread daily staple during the Classic period, beginning roughly around 300 BC. They were absolutely central to Aztec life. The Aztecs called them tlaxcali. The Spanish, who arrived with Hernán Cortés in 1519, gave them the name tortilla, which translates to little cake. What is truly remarkable about the tortilla is the chemistry behind it. Ancient Mesoamericans figured out a technique called nixtamalization, which involves soaking and cooking dried corn kernels in an alkaline solution made from lime water or wood ash. This loosens the tough outer hulls, makes the corn dramatically more nutritious and easier to digest, and transforms the ground kernels into a smooth, pliable dough called masa. Without this process, corn alone cannot sustain a large population. With it, entire civilizations thrived for thousands of years on a single crop. Corn held sacred status in Mesoamerican religion, and the tortilla's round shape was believed to represent the sun. Mayan legend holds that the very first tortilla was invented by a peasant as a gift for his hungry king. Making them was daily work, traditionally done by women who ground the corn by hand on a flat stone called a metate. When European colonists later arrived at Jamestown and Plymouth, their wheat crops repeatedly failed, and it was Native Americans who taught them to grow and cook corn instead. Tortillas and cornbread became literal survival foods. Today, the corn tortilla remains the most widely consumed food in all of Mexico, and the foundation of tacos, burritos, quesadillas, and enchiladas around the world. Injera. In Ethiopian and Eritrean cuisine, the bread does not just sit beside the meal. It is the meal. Injera is a large, spongy, slightly sour flatbread that serves triple duty as the plate, the utensil, and part of the food itself. Stews and salads are spooned directly onto a wide sheet of injera spread across the table, and diners tear off pieces to scoop up each bite with their hands. There is even a tradition called gursha, where you tear off a piece of injera, wrap it around a morsel of stew, and feed it to someone by hand as a gesture of love and respect. Injera is traditionally made from teff, one of the world's oldest cultivated grains, grown in the Ethiopian highlands for at least 4,000 years. Teff holds a charming distinction. Its name comes from the Amharic word meaning lost, because the grain is so incredibly tiny that if you drop a single seed on the ground, you will never find it. It is the smallest grain in the world. The process of making injera is closer to making a pancake than baking a loaf. Teff flour is mixed with water into a thin batter and left to ferment for several days, driven entirely by wild yeast and bacteria in the air, much like sourdough. The fermented batter is then poured in a slow spiral onto a large, hot clay griddle called a metad and covered with a lid so rising steam cooks the surface from above. The result is a soft, flexible, crepe-like bread dotted with tiny holes called eyes across the top, with a distinctly tangy flavor from the long fermentation. And because teff contains no gluten, injera is naturally gluten-free. Brioche. If there is one bread that blurs the line between bread and pastry, it is brioche. Made with generous amounts of eggs and butter, brioche has a soft, golden, almost cake-like crumb that feels more indulgent than any bread probably should. French pastry chefs have been making it for centuries. The famous Storer Bakery on Rue Montorgueil in Paris, the oldest patisserie in the city, opened in 1730 and has been selling brioche since the very beginning. But brioche's biggest claim to fame has nothing to do with how it tastes. It is the bread at the center of one of history's most misquoted phrases. "Let them eat cake" is actually a mistranslation. The original French is "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," which literally means "let them eat brioche." And the person who wrote it down was not Marie Antoinette. It was Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book Confessions, written around 1767. He attributed the words to a great princess, but never named her. According to biographer Antonia Fraser, Marie Antoinette was still a child living in Austria when Rousseau wrote that passage. The earliest source connecting her to the quote did not appear until more than 50 years after the French Revolution, in a journal published in 1843. Historians have even traced a version of the same story back to 16th century Germany, involving a noblewoman and sweetbread. So the most famous bread quote in all of history was not about cake. It was not said by the person everyone thinks said it, and the bread in question, brioche, was really just a slightly richer loaf that some unnamed royal thought the hungry masses ought to settle for. Today, brioche has traveled far beyond the patisseries of Paris. You will find it as burger buns, French toast, hot dog rolls, and weekend breakfast pastries in bakeries everywhere, from London to Los Angeles to Sydney. 14,000 years of flour, water, and heat. Every bread on this list started with roughly the same handful of ingredients, but the climate, the culture, and sometimes just a happy accident turned each one into something completely its own. If you want to see more food explainers like this, the next video is on screen right now.